Hello, CS161. My name is John. I'm one of the TAs for this class, and I am super excited and honored to kick off the first walkthrough for the first discussion of this fall semester of computer security. So, before diving into the material, the discussion walkthroughs are meant to recreate some of the in-person discussion vibes that we would have in a normal semester. But given the online setting, we'll be posting these around every Friday after the very last Thursday discussion, along with the worksheet solutions for anyone that's unable to make these discussions for the normal online discussions for whatever reason, or if you just want to revisit some of the concepts discussed in class. Great. And as mentioned in the note above, we are really looking forward to meeting all of you coming from all of course staff. So please feel free to come by office hours, especially in the virtual world. That's probably the best way that we can tailor help directly to you. Without you, office hours is pretty empty and pretty boring, so we would really love to see all your faces, get to know your names, and see how we can help you succeed in this class. Great. So without further ado, let's dive into the material itself. So for this first discussion, we're going to be covering three different concepts. We have GDB, x86, which is an assembly language, and also security principles. So GDB also stands for GNU Debugger, so this is going to be a great tool to help you inspect and figure out what's wrong with your C programs during the projects of this class. x86 is an assembly language that's kind of a contemporary to RISC-V. So hopefully you remember instruction set architecture and machine code from CS61C. x86 is similar to it, except it's a variant in language, and it's very popular, used by a lot of computer systems today. So this is what we're going to be delivering a lot of the class in when we talk about machine code level vulnerabilities. And then last but not least, security principles is hopefully something that you've seen in lecture already. If not, that's okay. During this discussion, we're going to try to solidify a lot of those definitions, and then we'll run through a couple practice problems to see if you can properly contextualize each of these principles given practical examples in the real world. Great. So diving into the first concept, we have GDB and a list of very interesting GDB commands that are worth checking out if you have the time and while you're working on the project. So before diving into the laundry list of commands, one of the first things to note is in order to actually enable GDB, what you want to do is when you're compiling your C program, so hopefully you remember GCC. You're going to want to add this dash, oh, not F, but G. Sorry, let me make that a bit more clear. Dash G, dash O. So dash O is a flag that kind of specifies the name of the executable spit out by the GCC compiler, and then you pass in the name of your C file itself. So after adding the dash G flag, this main executable becomes open to analysis by GDB. So to get GDB started, then you're just going to type GDB and then plug in the executable name. And that would be main from the above example. So once you enter GDB on the command line, you're going to be sent into this wonderful console which displays both the program itself and the lines of code associated with it, along with a console where you can type in inputs and run all of these commands. So let's go through them. The first one, which is run, or the shorthand for it is R, allows you to execute the program in question. So without setting any breakpoints or without adding any bells and whistles to your debugging environment, run is just going to run your program and execute normally, in the sense that if it's broken and there's some seg fault, it'll spit that out. If it works properly, it'll give you some desired result or some undesired result. Great. So run by itself is not super useful, but with the next set of commands, it becomes more useful. So the break command, which also has the alias of b, takes in either a function name, an address, or a line number. So for example, in your main.c file, let's just say that you have, the main method, so there's a bit of pseudocode, and then you have like an invocation of method A in your program. So for break, you can either specify I want method A, or if it's at, line, I guess 2 or 3 in this case, then you could plug in 2, so break 2, or you could find the address corresponding to this particular method. So you might recall from 61C, based on whether you're working in a 32-bit or 64-bit system, you're going to have a memory address of a corresponding appropriate length. So, like A, B, C, D, 0, 1, 2, 3. And you can plug that pointer to an address in, and it'll set a breakpoint at that line. So with the breakpoint, what that means is if you run a program from the beginning and there's a breakpoint, GDB will run the program up to the breakpoint, and when it hits the breakpoint, it'll hand over control back to you, and you can inspect your code at that particular point in your program. Great. So some of the commands that we can use to navigate the program when we hit our preset breakpoint are step with the alias s, or step I with the alias si, or next with the alias n. So if you might recall from CS61B, and if you used one of the recommended debuggers in one of the IDEs that the course staff put out there, whether it was like Eclipse or IntelliJ, you'll recall that the built-in debugging tool has some of these commands like step over, step into, next, and that's kind of the equivalent in GDB. So what step of S does is, let's just say that again with our main C program, we've specified a breakpoint, at line 2. And let's just say that, there's more code below this method that's kind of hidden. We don't see it, but we want to execute the lines, step by step. So what we would do here is just, if we did step S, what that would do is execute this method and then just go to the next line. If we did next instead of step, and if our breakpoint was here, what it would do is it wouldn't execute method, and it would just go to the next line. So both of these, like, take the function, either do something with it or don't, and then go to the next line. Now step I, or step into, as you might be able to surmise from the name of the command, is if your breakpoint is at line 2, then it's going to go into the method. So what that means is, somewhere else in the program, if we had like method A implemented, and there's some lines of code, then step I at a breakpoint set here would actually go into the instructions or the implementation of method A itself. Great. So that's kind of the single step navigation commands for GDB. If you feel like everything is working and you want to keep executing the program, you should use the continue command with the alias C. So usually what happens is you start with run, it's going to hit a breakpoint, and you check some things out. If everything looks good to you and you want to keep executing the program, you hit C, and it'll stop at the next breakpoint if there is one, or if there isn't, it'll just run the program to completion. Next, we have two commands that help a lot with printing. We have print P. So this F, this stuff in brackets, you can kind of read this as like a flag in a command line argument. So -F is where you would, or /F in this case, is where you would specify a format if you want to print the value specified in a particular way. Similar to the break command, here you can plug in a variable as opposed to function. So if you want to print out the value of, let's just say in method A, there's like a, int x is equal to 3, and you want to print out the value of x, you could just plug in x directly, or you could figure out which register corresponds to x and then plug that value in. Great. In addition, there's also X. So X is a bit more granular in terms of the way things are printed out. So the way to kind of read this list of arguments here is X is the name of the command. The N argument here specifies how much memory you want to print out. So the unit for n is either going to be b or w. So b corresponds to bytes, or w would be a word. So a word is 4 bytes, right? So x, I want to print out n, let's just say it's 3b, so that would be x3b, that would be 3 bytes, or x5w would be 5 words. And then similar to the format and print, you can specify how you want to print it out, whether it's as characters or as hex code with this C or X argument. And then last but not least, you would specify a memory address here to indicate like what values you actually want to print. So unlike print, you can't specify a variable directly. You're going to have to actually look for that 0x ABCDEFG address. No G, sorry. G is not a hex code. Cool. Great, so that's kind of for printing. The next interesting command is info. So let's just say you get tired of printing out values one by one, and you just kind of want to see a description of the context that your debugger has stopped in, right? So your debugger, let's just say it's stopped in method A, and you have a bunch of variables like X, Y, Z. Instead of printing out all of them, you could just plug in info frame, info args, or info locals. So this little like pipe vertical line character means like an logical OR. So these all do slightly different things. So info frame is going to give you a description of the current stack frame that you're sitting in. So you can kind of think of this as like scoping. Whatever scope you're currently in, whether it's in method A or in main, it's going to give you a description of kind of the values in the context that you're currently sitting in. Now, on the other hand, if you want to see the arguments associated with the function arguments associated with your stack frame, then you would plug in args. And then if you want to see a laundry list of the local variable values in your stack frame, then you use local. So really good at just giving you a lot of information in one command. Beyond that, there's also list. So list, its alias is L, and then you plug in line as the argument. So line is going to be a line number, just like it is in break. It'll just show you some of the surrounding nearby code in case you're staring at one line and you're not really sure what's leading up to it or what happens right after it. Disassemble or disas is pretty useful. It will be very useful in Project 1 when you try to figure out how to target certain vulnerabilities in your code based on what it looks like at an instruction level. So what this does is GDB will print out the translation of the code that you're looking at. This is the high-level C code into assembly language. So in this case, you would plug in a function. So for example, if I want to see the instruction or the instructions associated with method A in RISC-V, or in x86 in this case, I would just say disass, and then for function, plug in method A. Great. If you want to repeat a previous command, don't put in anything new. You don't have to retype it. Just click enter. And then last but not least, layout split allows you to sort of configure what your GDB interface or what the view looks like. So usually you'll just be given the source code and then sort of a little console for you to input these commands, but you could configure it to include, the source code section, the assembly code section, the command section, which is kind of that console for inputting values. And that's the summary of the basic but essential GDB commands that we would recommend you know. Okay, next up we have x86 assembly. So x86 assembly is an assembly language that's similar to RISC-V. The basic layout of x86 as as an instruction set architecture is very similar to what you learned in 61C. The tenets of memory layout as stack, the heap, the data, and the code, that still also remains the same. And we have a bit of a simplified view given right here. So as you can see, we have the memory layout for the 32-bit Linux. So again, like 32-bit, 64-bit just specifies how many memory addresses and your CPU's computing power on your device. And as you might recall from before, the stack, which is shown on the left, will grow downward. So if we want to populate items in the stack, we're going to have to decrement the address, versus if we're populating the heap, it grows upwards. And then on the right, we see the contents of one frame on the stack. So again, hopefully you would recall from 61C, but it's okay if not. The stack is responsible for holding local variables and function calls, and it grows downwards. So just, in general, you can imagine, the largest address of a program is going to be at the top. So we have, like, assuming this is a 32-bit machine, so you have like you have like 32 bits here represented by this address, so that's 0xFFFFFF, that's the largest address, and then at the bottom you have 0x0000 repeated 8 times, right? Because each hexadecimal character represents 4 binary bits. Cool. Great. So yeah, just starting from the top of this section, the 32-bit x86 prefixes its registers with E. x86-64, which is just kind of a variant, uses R. In this class, you only really need to be concerned with E. In AT&T syntax, there's a bunch of suffixes that clarify if instructions operate on bytes, 16-bit words, so on and so forth. So this is kind of similar to in 61C and RISC-V, if you use like add, add I, or just a variation of add where the suffix specifies, okay, what is the size of the data that this instruction would be dealing with. So just based on sort of computer history, there's 8 general purpose registers, EAX, EBX, CD, ESI, EDI, ESP, EBP. They are, for the most part, in modern days, pretty arbitrary. Like EAX was the register that was for accumulated values. I think it's called something accumulator X. C was for counting. For the most part, these purposes aren't sort of committed to the registers as much as they were before. There are a couple that still have a very definitive purpose that are important to know, though. So EIP is your instruction pointer. So I'll just write it here. So that's going to be the instruction pointer, and it points to the current instruction being executed. EBP and ESP. So one is the base pointer and one is the stack pointer. The base pointer points to the top of your current stack frame, and then the ESP, which is stack, that points to the bottom. So this is the top of the stack, this is the bottom of the stack. Great. We also have RIP, so that's return instruction pointer. And this holds the address that is jumped to after a function finishes executing. So you can kind of think of this as like where it returns to after function finishes. And then last but not least, we have SFP, or stack frame pointer. So this is like where the stack collapses to, like when stack information is cleared out. So we'd recommend you be pretty familiar with these, but in terms of just like being able to navigate which addresses are stored in which registers when the memory layout changes, whether it's the introduction of dynamic memory or how the stack is populated, or when a method A calls method B, how ESP and EBP update based on the addresses associated with each method. That's all going to be something that we assume you know from 61C. So as we mentioned, the stack grows downward, and we're going to do this by decrementing the ESP. 4, the reason it's 4 is just because, that's the iterative size of um, that's just kind of like the jump in memory that we're going to be making. And we also have the shortcut that they mentioned here. So push L, it's kind of like an alias for decrementing. We also have populate, we have L, which puts the memory into EBP and then increments ESP. So this is for, if our stack is growing. So you might recall from 61C that, when a function is executing at the machine code level, it always has a prologue and an epilogue. So this is the equivalent of that in x86. So as we can see here, given by the comments, we save the top of the previous frame, start the new frame by moving EBP down to ESP. So now the top pointer is pointing at the bottom of the original stack. And then we move the original bottom, which is ESP, down by the amount equivalent to the size of local variables. And then the corresponding exit, we're going to basically add the original size of local variables to ESP. So ESP recovers to its original position before this method was executed, or before this function was executed. We populate some values into EBP, and we increment ESP. So from this definition up here. Great. So hopefully these comments and the way that stacks are altered and how it grows or decrements is familiar. The purpose of this is really just to give you the x86 commands that correspond to it. So there's a handy link for sort of more descriptions of x86 commands. For this first project, again, you're going to be working in 32-bit just to keep the number of memory addresses a little bit smaller than 64-bit. Great. And that's pretty much it for x86 architecture for this class. If you'd like to learn more, there's a lot of links made from previous semesters of how x86 works when it comes to like a normal function call, if your program crashes, control flow diversion, or code injection. We'll make all of those links available on Piazza. Last but not least, we have security principles for this discussion. So security principles are a pretty interesting list of concepts that really characterize a lot of the tools and methodologies that we'll visit later on in this class. So it's important to go through these in lecture or in lecture notes for more thorough definitions and examples. But just in case, we'll review very quickly. We have 9 principles. So the first one is security is economics. So the idea here is that security isn't free, and if you're going to want to amp up the defenses on your system, it's going to cost you a pretty penny. So the goal of this principle is it reminds us that while every defense has its own sort of offense, so every defense has its own attack, we don't have to defend a system against every attack in the known universe, but rather we just want to defend it enough such that it deters potential attackers from even trying. So again, it's this balance between how much you spend on defense and then what the expected losses are. Least privilege is pretty revealed by its name. So the idea of least privilege is that you should only allow enough access to a particular user or entity to perform the job that they're supposed to do, or their responsibility, and nothing more than that. So, if a particular user is only allowed to read a file, but is not allowed to write or to comment on a file like you might have in Google Drive, you don't want to give them more privileges beyond reading, such as writing or commenting. So those would be unnecessary and leave your system, or in this case your Google document, open to unwanted modifications. Knowing your threat model is important and is a big theme in the research community. The idea is that you want to be able to assess and document a system's security risks. You want to know what attacks are coming at you, how they might be executed, and what the proper defenses are. Defense in depth alludes to the idea that if you have multiple layers of protection, that means that attackers have much more to go through. So as Professor Weaver discusses in lecture, there's this concept of layering with a bunch of walls. If you have a lot of walls and it's not just a single wall, having defenders climb through multiple walls or multiple defenses is more tiresome. Considering human factors, so this is pretty much the idea that like while we can design systems that are technically rigorous or executes correctly, security that is unwieldy or not friendly to users in practice may as well just be useless. So the idea here is that when you design your system, in addition to technical correctness and rigor, you also want to take into account your users and who's actually interacting with the system, and whether security is something that is feasible and easily incorporated by the user in their practice. We have design in security from the start. So this kind of alludes to this principle of like secure by design. And it's usually better if you have a good initial design that incorporates security as opposed to bootstrapping security onto a legacy system after it's built out. So, as opposed to patching a system after, it's recommended that you just design in the defenses from the start. Great. So the ensure complete mediation refers to this idea of having a single point of through which all accesses must occur. So if you remember that diagram from class of that toll booth where it guards the road, but then because of the tire tracks around the gate, you can see that people just circumvented that point of access. So complete mediation should be a single point that is unavoidable for users to go through, that is tamper-proof, and is also verifiable, meaning that it's correct. Division of trust refers to this idea that you don't have like a single entity that serves as a point of failure. If you can distribute failure across multiple entities or distribute responsibilities across multiple entities, it makes your system a bit more robust and difficult for the attacker to break into, because then there's one point that they would have to break. There's multiple points that the attacker would have to break into as opposed to one. So as alluded to in lecture, this is the idea that, if someone in the military wants to fire a nuclear weapon, that multiple keys as opposed to one key needs to be used. And then last but not least, we have Shannon's maxim. So this comes from a famous American mathematician called Claude Shannon. And the quote that this originates from is, "One ought to design systems under the assumption that the enemy will immediately gain full familiarity with them." So what this means in a nutshell is, don't practice security by obscurity. Building a defense around the idea that the attacker will be too lazy to figure out how a particular system works is probably not a good idea. Great. So hopefully, with that working definition, some of these questions below become a little bit easier to answer. And let's just go through them. So identify the principles relevant to each of the following scenarios. So for number one, we have new cars often come with a valet key. The valet key is intended to be used by valet drivers or user who will park your car for you. So this key opens the door and turns on the ignition, but it does not open the trunk or the glove compartment. So what does this tell us? Well, this key, which is kind of like a different set of permissions for a special user, so not you who owns the car, but for the valet driver, it's supposed to do two things. So open the car, turn on the ignition so the valet driver can drive it, but it doesn't open the trunk or the glove compartment. So the idea here is that you have limited access, you have limited privileges, and it's limited to what the valet driver needs, what services it needs to actually accomplish the intended goal. So this is a pretty textbook representation of principles of least privilege. So again, the idea here is that a valet driver doesn't need to access your trunk or the glove compartment in order to park the car successfully. So you don't allow them to perform those actions. Great. So for number 2, many homeowners leave a house key. So they leave a house key under the floor mat in front of their door. So you might, hopefully you'll be able to infer from this that the idea is that if a homeowner loses their key in order to get a quick copy, they just assume that they can hide a key at a place that nobody else knows. So they are hiding their key or hiding access to their house by obscurity, right? They're assuming that, oh, nobody else knows or nobody understands the layout of my house. But the problem with this is that a very motivated robber or someone very motivated at observing this person's behavior could easily figure out where this house key is simply by just stalking or following the house owner, the homeowner. So this again is an example of Shannon's maxim. So again, this is security, like don't do security by obscurity. So again, don't assume that criminals, don't know the layout of your house because this is something that they can figure out without needing any permissions or any special access. Great. Number 3, it is not worth it to use a $400,000 bike lock to protect a $100 bike. So the important things this question is trying to point out is that there's this really, really big contrast in the system that you're protecting, which is your bike in this case, and then the defense for your system, which is your bike lock, right? So if you have a defense that is way overpriced and way more valuable than the asset that you're protecting in the first place, then you employ this idea of security as economics. It's much better if you just buy a new bike if you lose it, as opposed to installing this $400,000 bike lock. So this is security is economics. Great. Awesome. So 4 is a little bit longer, so let's parse through it. Warranties on cell phones do not cover accidental damage, which includes liquid damage, but unfortunately for cell phone companies, many consumers who accidentally damage their phones with liquid will wait for it to dry and then take it to the store, claiming that, quote unquote, it broke by itself. To combat this threat, many companies have begun to include on the product a small sticker that turns red and stays red when it gets wet. So what are the things to pay attention to? Well, we have a sort of our system or the asset or the thing of value, which is a warranty on your cell phone. And the idea is that it shouldn't cover accidental damage. So that's sort of like one of the things that this system or this asset should not be used if it's accidental damage, right? But now it identifies we have certain consumers who do accidentally damage their phone, wait for it to dry, and then claim that it broke by itself. So you can sort of think of this as the attacker. This is your sort of like human-driven threat model, right? And then in order to combat this threat model, many companies have begun to include this small sticker that turns red when it gets wet. So there's actually a couple principles that are associated here. The first one is because we're dealing with people who are trying to circumvent this. So this is not sort of like a technical coded bug or coded attack. Rather, this is just sort of like guarding against human behavior. So what that alludes to is that you should be considering human factors. So the idea here is that we don't assume that the people who have these warranties are going to act in a trustworthy manner. We assume that people are going to be malicious and they're going to lie for accidental damage, and that is something that you should take into account. So that's an example of considering human factors. Now, there's also another one in play where if your threat manifests, then the system as is, which is the warranties on cell phones or the protocol when it comes to evaluating phone damage and then determining whether the warranty should be used. So that threat model, that system or that protocol doesn't take into account this threat model, right? So the resolution that this question highlights is that we use a small sticker that turns red. So the idea is that we attach a defense to this product so that when the threat occurs, it's already defended against, right? So by including a sticker from the beginning, from the start, we are defending against this threat so that when it occurs, we don't have to backtrack and patch the system for this threat. So what we're alluding to here is design and security from the start. Right. So as opposed to trying to figure out whether the phone was accidentally damaged or not after the damage has occurred, we add in the detection before it even occurs in the first place. Great. So number 5, social security numbers were not originally designed as a secret identifier. Nowadays, they're often easily obtainable or guessable. So what's the problem here? So they were not originally designed as a secret identifier, even though they are used that way now. And that leads to them currently being easily obtainable or guessable. So out of the list of issues above, it's not related to economics or privilege or the threat model. It's more related to the fact that when it was originally designed, a certain threat associated with, stealing an identity was not taken into account. So what should have been done here is, again, designing security from the start. Designing in security from the start. So because the purpose of the social security number and the social security system changed and it didn't take into account that it would become an identifier, the lack of consideration of future threats geared towards its new purpose was never taken into account. So the appropriate defenses could never have been installed in the first place. Great. Number 6, even if you use a password on your laptop lock screen, there is software which lets a skilled attacker with specialized equipment to bypass it. So what are we looking at here? So even if we use a password, so that's kind of like our defense for our laptop system, there is still software, so that's kind of like the attacker, which lets a skilled attacker with specialized equipment to bypass it. So what does this kind of allude to, right? We have a system, we have a defense, and then we have an attack on this defense. So from this statement, we could sort of assume some of the other principles, such as, oh, well, we should, design in security from the start, potentially, if there was some consideration that we didn't take into account. Maybe we can divide trust, not just among the password, but also through different points of access. But the main thing that this one statement alludes to and tells us definitively is that we should know our threat model. So, we believe that our password works, but the awareness of this software indicates that there is a threat and that we're aware that there's this dynamic where there's a defense that we assume that works, but it doesn't because of this software. So to quote a former TA, the practical, there is actually software that does this. It's called PCI Leech, and there's a whole slew of hardware for password cracking that's pretty interesting. So know your threat model. And the flip side to this is also by knowing your threat model, you'll also kind of see that like most petty thieves probably shouldn't have access to this kind of software because it's expensive and it requires a certain technical knowledge to obtain. So the idea is that even if this threat exists, we can quantify how widespread it is and how deleterious it is, so we can sort of identify that cost when it comes to security as economics by knowing our threat model. Great. So Shamir's secret sharing scheme allows us to split a secret between multiple people so that all of them have to collaborate in order to recover the secret, right? So we have a single secret, but it's split between multiple people, and then we see that all of them have to collaborate in order to recover the secret. So this is similar to the idea of, if I want to fire a destructive weapon, then we have multiple people with multiple keys who agree on this action. So this is alluding to division of trust, right? So then that idea here is that we require multiple people or everyone involved or everyone invested in the system to come together to have to produce a secret to bypass the defense and actually access whatever is there. So this would also prevent one person from using the secret alone. In the modern day, when it comes to sort of like distributed systems that involve a lot of users that don't trust one another, this principle of division of trust is what allows multiple distrusting users to share a system, safely knowing that one person won't take advantage or access the system without another person knowing. Great. DRM encryption is often effective until someone can reverse engineer the decryption algorithm. So, what are we paying attention to here? DRM encryption is our sort of defense, but then it's rendered useless when someone can reverse engineer the decryption algorithm. So this one is a little bit tricky. If we're scrolling back up and we kind of take a look, it's not securities economics because there's no real cost that we're balancing. It's not least privilege in the sense that we're not saying someone should know, or we're giving authentication to someone. It's not human factors. We're not considering people's behavior. It's not defense in depth because we're not layering multiple defenses together. We're not really thinking about security from the start as a way to defend against this. It's not division of trust because there's no multiple people. Complete mediation refers to a single point of access, which isn't quite this. So one of the answers that comes up a lot is know your threat model, which in a certain sense could be true in that you have a defense and now you want to know what the attack is. But the reason that's is not quite right is because there is no real attack. The idea here is that it's rendered useless if someone can reverse engineer. So it's less a reference to an attack that we should be aware of and that we should take into account with our cost model, and more about Shannon's maxim. So security through obscurity. So the issue with the statement here is that we're assuming that this thing is effective until someone is capable of reverse engineering the decryption algorithm or understanding the system, which in this case is the decryption pairing to the encryption. So the idea here in one statement is that we should be assuming that the attacker knows the system in this case, so knows how DRM encryption and decryption works, because if we don't and the attacker figures out how decryption works, then the encryption step is no longer effective. And someone can view whatever secrets are encoded with this encryption algorithm forever. Great. Banks often make you answer your security questions over the phone. Answers to these questions are quote-unquote low entropy, meaning that they are easy to guess. Some security-conscious people instead use a random password as the answer to the security question. However, attackers can sometimes convince the phone representative by claiming, quote, I just put in some nonsense for that question. So what do we have here? Well, we have the system that we're defending against. We have our security measures, so we have our security questions. answers to these are low entropy, meaning that they are easy to guess, which is not great. Now, so there's two threats presented here. One of them is that people use a random password, and then the other human behavior is that because of this semi-popular practice, a malicious person could just say, "Oh, I put some random stuff in my password." The person verifying would have no way of knowing, and by saying the statement, the attacker could, say, "I forgot," reset the password without the right permissions, and then break into a person's account, right? So what this is demonstrating is that even though we have a system and a security defense measure against illegal accesses to the bank account. So what we're saying here is that we have a system, the defense works properly from a technical standpoint, but because of human behavior, it's rendered a bit useless. So what this is referring to is that we should be considering human factors. So we have a defense that works properly. The mechanism and the code behind it is all sound. It's been well tested. But the reason it doesn't work in practice is not because it doesn't check out, but more because it's used incorrectly because of human behavior, and that errant behavior or inappropriate behavior from a security standpoint is taken advantage of. Great. Last but not least, we have the very last question. Oftentimes at bars, an employee will wait outside the only entrance to the bar, enforcing that people who want to enter the bar form a single file line. Then the employee checks each individual's ID to verify if they are 21 before allowing them entry into the bar. So, oftentimes at a bar, so this is kind of the thing that we're protecting, and the rule that we're enforcing, or the security measure we're enforcing, is this person 21, right? And the way we do that is we have an employee that waits outside the only entrance to the bar, right? And this employee's responsibility is to enforce if these people are 21, right? So that's kind of like the defense. If you're coming in and you're legal, then it's okay. So what the highlighted keywords should reveal to you pretty quickly is, because it's an only entrance, and because we have an employee that's actually checking each individual one by one for this condition, what this is a great example of, in sort of less CS and just more everyday practice terms, is complete mediation. So the idea here, you might remember, is that we should have a single point of access that everybody has to filter through and everybody has to check against in order to enter the bar, right? So whether this is making sure you're legal when going through a bar, or making sure you don't have certain items when going through TSA at an airport. The idea is that in order to get into a system, whether it's a bar or an airport or a computer system, you have a single point of access that everybody has to come through, and there's no back door that someone could slip into and evade the required authentication for them to get in.